A sweet, spiced scent of warm apple pie drifted through the mess hall, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of fear and stale uniforms that had clung to them for weeks. Outside, the Arizona sun beat down, baking the dusty ground, but inside, a strange, almost unsettling tranquility prevailed. For the young German soldiers, fresh from the battlefields of North Africa or the hedgerows of Normandy, this was not the America their propaganda had painted. This was not the brutal, unforgiving enemy they had been taught to expect. Instead, they were offered a slice of a life that felt impossibly distant from the war raging across oceans. Tell me, where are you watching this story from today? It was 1943. Thousands of German prisoners of war were arriving on American shores, funneled into a network of over 500 camps spread across the United States, from the arid plains of Texas to the pine forests of Maine. These men, many still in their teens, expected barbed wire, hard labor, and barely edible rations. What they encountered instead was often a shocking blend of structured discipline and unexpected amenities. They saw clean beds, regular meals, and even opportunities for education. How could a nation at war treat its enemies with such bewildering decency? And what, precisely, was the true cost, or indeed the ultimate purpose, behind such an extraordinary approach to wartime captivity? Consider the experience of Private Heinrich Schmidt, captured during the Tunisian campaign. His diary, later discovered and archived, speaks of his arrival at Camp Bowie, Texas. He wrote of the stark, whitewashed barracks, the air thick with the smell of fresh lumber and disinfectant, a far cry from the cramped, filthy conditions he'd imagined. He noted the small, almost trivial detail of fresh linen on his cot, a luxury he hadn't seen since basic training. "They gave us coffee," he penned. "Real coffee, not ersatz. And then, the pie. Apfelkuchen. It was beyond belief. This wasn't just about food. It was about a deeply ingrained psychological expectation being shattered piece by piece." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a different kind of meticulousness was at play. Dr. Albert Goldstein, a German-born psychologist working for the U.S. War Department, meticulously reviewed reports flowing in from various camps. His office at Fort Hood, Virginia, a site so secret it didn't officially exist on public maps, was filled with the rustle of paper, the quiet click of typewriters, and the hushed conversations of analysts. Dr. Goldstein understood the profound impact of these small human gestures. He knew that every book offered, every movie shown, every unexpected kindness was being observed, cataloged, and analyzed for its potential effect. His worn copy of the Geneva Conventions, dog-eared from constant reference, was a constant companion, not just a legal text, but a guide to a complex human experiment unfolding across the continent. The initial shock among the German POWs wasn't just about the food or the relative comfort. It was about the fundamental dissonance between their worldview and the reality unfolding before them. Their leaders had painted America as a decadent, weak nation, yet here was a powerful adversary demonstrating a level of organization and, frankly, humanity that defied all their indoctrination. This wasn't merely about adhering to international law. It felt like something far more deliberate, a subtle current flowing beneath the surface of everyday camp life. What were the specific mechanisms put in place to manage this unprecedented influx of enemy soldiers? And how did these policies begin to reshape the very identities of the men held within American borders? The answers would prove to be far more intricate than simple benevolence. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. By the summer of 1944, over 370,000 German POWs were scattered across the American landscape, a silent army far from the front lines. Their management required an infrastructure of unparalleled precision, designed by the Provost Marshal General's office. Camps, often built from scratch, were meticulously planned. The air around these facilities, especially in the agricultural heartlands, began to carry the scent of freshly turned earth, mixed with the unfamiliar aroma of American cooking. These men weren't just confined, they were integrated, albeit temporarily, into the very fabric of the nation they were fighting. The primary mechanism for managing this influx was a rigorous work program. War Department Circular No. 192, issued in June 1943, outlined the compulsory labor for able-bodied prisoners, adhering strictly to the Geneva Conventions. This wasn't merely about keeping men occupied, it was a strategic deployment of manpower to bolster the American home front, replacing civilian laborers who had gone to war. From dawn, the rhythmic clang of shovels against soil or the steady hum of machinery would fill the air as POWs were put to work. They harvested crops in Texas, felled timber in the Pacific Northwest, and even worked in canning factories in the Midwest, their rough uniforms often stained with dirt and sweat. Consider Camp Hearn, Texas, where thousands of German prisoners toiled in cotton fields. Colonel John L. Kennedy, the camp commander, noted in his quarterly report that the prisoners, initially reluctant, often found a strange sense of purpose in the physical labor. One POW, Corporal Klaus Richter, wrote in a letter home, heavily censored, of course, about the vastness of the American fields, the feeling of the dry earth beneath his boots, and the almost meditative rhythm of picking cotton under the unrelenting sun. This work, while arduous, also provided a stark contrast to the grim reality of combat, offering a different kind of exhaustion, one that ended with a hot meal and a clean cot, rather than a foxhole. But this integration was not without friction. Local communities, like those served by the El Paso Herald-Post, debated the morality and economic impact of utilizing enemy labor, raising questions about fairness to American workers and the perceived luxury of enemy treatment. Beyond the physical labor, a more subtle yet equally potent campaign was underway: re-education. Dr. Goldstein at Fort Hunt wasn't just observing, he was helping to shape policy. The strategy was to subtly erode Nazi ideology by exposing POWs to democratic ideals. Libraries were established in camps, stocked not with propaganda, but with American history books, classic literature, and even current newspapers. Imagine the quiet rustle of pages in a barracks after a day's work. A group of young Germans poring over articles about American elections or local community initiatives, their faces illuminated by a single bare bulb. These weren't overt lectures. They were opportunities carefully curated. Films, often documentaries or classic Hollywood features, were screened regularly. The scent of popcorn, a distinctly American aroma, sometimes mingled with the stale air of the makeshift cinemas. These films, again, weren't overtly political, but showcased American life, culture, and democratic processes. For many POWs, this was their first unfiltered glimpse into the society they had been taught to despise, a stark visual counterpoint to the dehumanizing caricatures painted by their own regime. We're delving into a hidden chapter of history here, revealing how a nation at war chose to engage with its enemies in profoundly unexpected ways. If you're finding this deep dive into the human complexities of conflict as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing to Whispers from WW2. It's how we continue to uncover these untold stories, bringing you meticulous research and cinematic narratives that challenge conventional perspectives. This deliberate exposure created a profound internal conflict. While some remained staunchly loyal to their Nazi beliefs, others began to question the narratives they had been fed. The relatively humane conditions, the access to information, and the daily interactions, however limited, with American guards and civilians, chipped away at their indoctrination. How did this internal ideological battle manifest within the camps themselves? And what specific techniques did the U.S. employ to accelerate this shift in allegiance, transforming potential enemies into something else entirely? This deliberate exposure created a profound internal conflict. While some remained staunchly loyal to their Nazi beliefs, others began to question the narratives they had been fed. The relatively humane conditions, the access to information, and the daily interactions, however limited, with American guards and civilians, chipped away at their indoctrination. How did this internal ideological battle manifest within the camps themselves? And what specific techniques did the U.S. employ to accelerate this shift in allegiance, transforming potential enemies into something else entirely? The internal ideological battle was fierce, often silent, but sometimes violently overt. Within the barbed wire fences, the POW population fractured. Staunch Nazis, often identified by their unwavering adherence to party doctrine and the swastika insignia they sometimes carved into their personal effects, clashed with a growing faction of anti-Nazis and white prisoners, those who had lost faith in the regime or were simply exhausted by its demands. At camps like Fort Douglas, Utah, the tension was palpable, a low hum beneath the surface of daily routines. The air in the mess halls could turn thick with unspoken animosity, a single glance enough to ignite a confrontation, sometimes escalating into brutal attacks where anti-Nazis were severely beaten or even murdered by their more fanatical compatriots. This internal strife wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct. It was a carefully observed phenomenon. The U.S. military intelligence, under the guidance of figures like Dr. Goldstein, deployed sophisticated methods to monitor these divisions. Ferret programs utilized German-speaking American soldiers, often of German descent, to infiltrate the camps disguised as POWs. They lived among the prisoners, enduring the same rations and the same dust-choked barracks, their senses alert to every hushed conversation, every whispered complaint, every defiant declaration. These undercover agents, like Corporal Paul G. Revere, would record observations in tiny notebooks, the graphite smudged by sweat, detailing the subtle shifts in allegiance, the emergence of dissident leaders, and the persistent presence of hardliners. What secrets did these ferrets uncover that proved most valuable in shaping the American strategy? The intelligence gathered was meticulously analyzed at places like Fort Hunt, Virginia, where Dr. Goldstein and his team sifted through thousands of pages of reports. The objective was clear: identify the unshakable Nazis, isolate them, and conversely, cultivate the anti-Nazis. This was not about simple segregation. It was about psychological warfare waged on a deeply personal level. The U.S. War Department began to implement special projects, targeted re-education programs designed for those deemed salvageable. These programs often took place in separate, more comfortable facilities, sometimes referred to as model camps within the larger system, where the smell of freshly laundered uniforms and the quiet rustle of new books replaced the general camp stench. One such project, the reorientation program, saw selected prisoners transferred to camps with enhanced educational opportunities. Imagine a small classroom, the late afternoon sun streaming through a single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, as a group of German POWs listened intently to a lecture on the U.S. Constitution or the principles of democratic governance. These were not forced indoctrination sessions, but rather carefully structured discussions led by American educators and sometimes even German émigrés, designed to encourage critical thinking. They were given access to a wider array of American literature, philosophy, and history, the smooth texture of heavy textbook paper a constant tactile reminder of their unique status. The aim was to foster a new understanding of political systems, to plant seeds of democratic thought in minds previously cultivated by totalitarian ideology. But did these efforts genuinely change hearts and minds, or were they merely a superficial veneer, easily shed once the war ended? And how did this selective treatment impact the overall morale and future prospects of the vast majority of POWs who remained in the regular camps? The selective treatment indeed created palpable divisions. The reorientation program participants, often housed in designated sections of larger camps or in entirely separate facilities like Fort Kearny, Nebraska, experienced a different quality of captivity. Here, the air was often quieter, filled with the murmur of discussion rather than the boisterous shouts of the work details. The smooth, cool pages of American textbooks became a constant tactile presence, a contrast to the rough texture of work gloves. Dr. Goldstein's team meticulously tracked these individuals, observing their engagement with democratic principles, their willingness to openly critique Nazi ideology. These men, exposed to a steady diet of American political thought and cultural norms, often found themselves increasingly alienated from their former comrades. They were learning, adapting, but also becoming outsiders within their own group, their perspectives fundamentally shifting. This created a visible schism. For the vast majority of POWs still in regular camps, toiling in fields or factories, the news of these model camps, or special projects, filtered through like rumors. The feeling of resentment, a dull ache beneath the surface, could sometimes fester. While they worked, their muscles aching from long hours, the scent of fresh-cut hay, or the metallic tang of machinery filling their lungs, they knew some of their countrymen were reading books and watching films. This disparity fueled existing factionalism, hardening the resolve of some loyalists and creating a deeper sense of injustice for others. The War Department, in its internal memos, acknowledged this tension, recognizing it as a necessary consequence of their strategic approach, fostering division to weaken ideological unity. The practical impact of the POW labor, however, was undeniable and far-reaching. By 1945, nearly 400,000 German POWs were contributing significantly to the American war economy, filling critical labor shortages. The rhythmic thud of their hoes in sugar beet fields across Colorado, or the steady clang of their tools in lumber camps in Oregon, became a familiar sound in many rural communities. This wasn't just about economic utility, it was a deeper integration into the daily life of America. In places like Roswell, New Mexico, POWs helped harvest vast pecan orchards, their rough uniforms a familiar sight to local farmers. Mr. Thomas D. Davis, a local historian and former farm owner in Roswell, recalled in a 1998 interview how the German prisoners, despite the language barrier, often developed a surprising camaraderie with the American foremen, sharing stories and even jokes over lunch breaks, the scent of freshly baked bread mingling with the dust of the fields. These daily interactions, however mundane, were powerful. They chipped away at stereotypes on both sides. The American public, initially wary, began to see the prisoners not just as faceless enemies, but as individuals capable of hard work and even humor. Conversely, the POWs saw Americans not just as the decadent plutocrats of Nazi propaganda, but as pragmatic, often kind, and surprisingly diverse people. This subtle cultural exchange was an unintended but significant consequence of the work program, creating a bridge where propaganda had built walls. The question then emerged, after years of this unprecedented interaction: how would these men, fundamentally altered by their American experience, reconcile with the shattered homeland they were expected to return to? As the war drew to a close, a new kind of anxiety settled over the camps, thick and palpable as a summer storm. The heavy thud of official telegrams arriving at camp commander offices, detailing repatriation protocols, brought a bittersweet reality. For many, the idea of returning to a Germany devastated by war, its cities in ruins and its future uncertain, was daunting. The contrast with their relatively stable, well-fed existence in American camps became stark. Dr. Goldstein's reports from Fort Hunt began to highlight a growing dilemma. A significant number of POWs expressed a desire to remain in the U.S., or at least to delay their return, their voices tinged with a quiet desperation. Consider the case of Private Franz Huber, held at Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky. His personal letters, later declassified, reflect this profound ambivalence. He wrote of the beauty of the Kentucky landscape, the taste of fresh American coffee, and the unexpected friendships forged with fellow prisoners for regions of Germany he'd never visited. He questioned whether he could ever truly go back to the ruins, to the ideology that had led them there. The very air in the barracks seemed to hum with this collective uncertainty, a mixture of longing for family and fear of the unknown. This was a direct, practical consequence of the humane treatment. It had fostered a sense of belonging, however temporary, that made the idea of returning to a broken nation deeply unsettling. What then were the final, decisive factors that determined whether a German POW would return home, or whether a select few might carve out a new life in the land of their former enemy? The answer lay in a complex interplay of politics, individual choices, and a final, surprising twist of fate. The answer lay in a complex interplay of politics, individual choices, and a final, surprising twist of fate. The U.S. War Department, in collaboration with Allied powers, established stringent criteria for repatriation. The primary directive, outlined in official communiques from early 1945, was to return all German POWs to their zones of occupation in Germany, primarily to aid in the monumental task of post-war reconstruction. However, not all were treated equally. The black prisoners, the staunch Nazis, were flagged for immediate and often expedited return, their ideological rigidity making them unsuitable for any potential re-education efforts in Germany. The air around these groups, even in their final days in American camps, often crackled with a defiant, almost desperate loyalty, a stark contrast to the quiet apprehension of others. For the white and gray prisoners, those who had renounced Nazism or were simply apolitical, the path was more nuanced. The reorientation programs, which Dr. Goldstein had so carefully overseen, had produced a cadre of individuals whose perspectives had genuinely shifted. These men, having absorbed democratic ideals and witnessed a different way of life, presented a unique opportunity. A select few, those who had demonstrated consistent anti-Nazi sentiment and a clear understanding of democratic principles, were identified for a special, highly secretive program. They were not merely repatriated, they were prepared. Their files, thick with reports from ferrets and camp psychologists, spoke of a transformation, a subtle scent of hope amidst the despair of a shattered world. The ultimate fate for these select individuals often hinged on their participation in the intellectual diversion program or similar initiatives. These were the men who, at places like Fort Hunt, had spent their days poring over American newspapers, debating political philosophy, and even producing anti-Nazi propaganda for dissemination in the bustling ports of embarkation, like New York and New Orleans, were filled with the cacophony of thousands of men, the metallic clang of luggage, and the hushed goodbyes to a land that had unexpectedly become a temporary home. The ships themselves, often converted troop transports, carried a cargo of complex emotions. Private Heinrich Schmidt, whose diary we encountered earlier, wrote on the eve of his departure, "The taste of apple pie will forever be America, but the taste of ash, that will be Germany." The rough wooden planks of the gangway felt heavy under his boots, each step a movement towards an uncertain future. This wasn't just a physical return. It was a profound psychological re-entry into a reality most could barely comprehend. The final decisions on who returned and who, for a fleeting moment, might have had a different option were often made far from the camps, in the hushed offices of the War Department, under the flickering fluorescent lights of late-night strategizing sessions. General Maxwell Taylor, then commander of the 101st Airborne, later played a role in the initial occupation of Germany. And his observations from that period underscored the desperate need for stable leadership. The U.S. understood that simply returning hundreds of thousands of men, some still ideologically entrenched, others deeply disillusioned, could destabilize an already fragile post-war Europe. If this intricate dance of wartime policy and human psychology has given you a fresh perspective on history, please consider hitting the like button. It helps us know these deeper dives into the human story resonate with you. The twist of fate was subtle but significant. While mass repatriation was the rule, a tiny fraction of POWs, primarily those who had actively collaborated with U.S. intelligence as ferrets, or had been part of the most intensive re-education programs, were offered a path to remain in the United States, usually under strict conditions and with a change of identity. These were men who had burned their bridges with the Nazi regime and whose lives would be in danger if they returned. Their existence here was a testament to the depth of the American re-education gamble, a quiet acknowledgement that some individuals had indeed been profoundly transformed. They swapped the rough texture of a prisoner's uniform for civilian clothes, often feeling the crisp fabric of a new shirt as a symbol of their second chance. Their stories, often lost to history, speak of a new life forged in the land of their former captors, a life lived under the shadow of a past they could never fully escape. The vast majority, however, did return to a Germany scarred by war. But they returned carrying more than just personal belongings. They carried the indelible mark of their American captivity. For many, the seeds of democratic thought, carefully planted by Dr. Goldstein's programs and nourished by unexpected kindnesses, began to sprout amidst the rubble. General Lucius D. Clay, then the U.S. military governor of Germany, would later note the observable difference in those who had passed through American camps, often finding them more receptive to democratic principles and vital to the establishment of new civic structures. The memory of the apple pie, its sweet taste lingering, became a quiet counter-narrative to the bitterness of defeat, a symbol of a different possibility. The initial shock, the central paradox of humane treatment from an enemy, ultimately made strategic sense. It was not merely benevolence, but a calculated investment in a post-war future. The U.S. had understood that winning the war wasn't enough. They needed to win the peace. And that meant subtly reshaping the ideology of a defeated nation, one soldier at a time. The quiet rustle of textbook pages, the scent of popcorn in a makeshift cinema, the shared laughter over a piece of pie. These seemingly small gestures were, in fact, powerful tools of psychological warfare, designed to fracture loyalty to Nazism and foster a nascent appreciation for democratic values. The unexpected comforts weren't a luxury. They were a long-game strategy to rebuild a nation from within. The consequences rippled for decades. German-American relations, in the post-war era, were underpinned by an unexpected foundation of shared experience, however complex. The men who returned, though often silent about their time in American camps, carried a unique perspective that influenced their families and communities. The taste of apple pie, once a shocking anomaly, became an enduring, if subtle symbol of a nation that chose to engage its enemies not just with bombs, but with books, with work, and with an unexpected slice of humanity. What do you think about using such unexpected kindness as a strategic tool in warfare? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're compelled by these untold chapters of history, subscribe to Whispers from WW2 to ensure you don't miss our next cinematic investigation into the human stories behind the headlines.